Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to this session. So we're going to spend some time just talking about sort of inequity and equity within the context of algorithmic decision-making, and particularly thinking about like how we can move towards bias prevention and not just mitigation. And we've got two fantastic people over here today. We've got Elaine Nsoesie who's an associate professor in the Department of Global Health at Boston University. She also leads the Racial Data Tracker project at the Boston University Center of Anti-Racist Research. She's a data science faculty fellow and a founding faculty fellow at the Boston University Faculty of Computing and Data Science. It's a lot. She currently leads the Artificial Intelligence Machine Learning Consortium to advance health equity research at the NIH, and her research is mainly focused around data and technology to advance health equity, but public health equity, so beyond healthcare. And then we have David Robertson. David Robertson's a visiting scholar at the Social Science Matrix at the University of California, Berkeley, and a member of the faculty at Upper University. David also just published a book called Voices in Code, which very much touches on these topics. So I thought I'll cue up David around sort of just thinking about health equity throughout the pipeline. How do you thinking about like where do we start? Do we start by identifying the inequities that are currently in place in decision-making systems? Do we start by like how do we think about addressing them?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think in practice we start in the middle, right? We exist in a world where there already are all kinds of systems around us, health and software and otherwise. And I think the question which very often presents itself is how to engage with those in a way that improves. And then occasionally we have these opportunities where things really get rethought. And that's where you have, in some sense, something close to a fresh start. And so the book, so Voices in the Code, is about one of those times when in the United States, there was an effort to reimagine the software that gives out donated organs for transplants, specifically kidneys, where, and they have a long tradition in the transplant world of having this software that matches people up with the donated organs be designed in a collaborative way. I'd actually come at this from outside of health originally, but from sort of criminal legal system context where, there's software in the courtroom saying, is this person dangerous or not? Or in a social services, like a financial support kind of a setting, like how much support should someone get? Or even in like a hiring, like a personnel context, who would be a good person for this job? And, working with civil rights advocates, it's very often the case that we would say, well, this is poorly designed. It was, there wasn't public input. It's not being audited. It's not transparent. Does it even work? And so people were sort of imagining new ways to govern these kinds of systems, people talking about public input, people talking about the idea of having, community participation in the design, or having various kinds of transparency, or having audits that are from an outside expert party. So those things, in this context of this story of the transplant, actually some students, when I was teaching a law school seminar, had identified this example and said, hey, there's a lot of that stuff already happening here. And anyway, that's what became the book, is what can we learn from this? So the experts, in this case, the clinicians and data scientists, wanted originally to sort of maximize the total benefit from this pool of organs. But it turns out that if you do that, it means giving organs to the youngest and healthiest among the people who need organs, which is also going to mean in, practical terms, it's wealthier. In the US, this is a kind of a white-leaning population who are being closely followed by their doctors, right? So they changed, so that's what they tried to do, but they took that out for public input, and people said, this would be very unfair. You can't do it this way. And pushed back. And what ended up happening instead was sort of a messy compromise where basically the youngest and healthiest organs ended up going to the youngest and healthiest recipients, but then each person's chance of getting a transplant was preserved from the prior system. So nobody was told, well, you're not going to. Anyway, but, and there were some, in particular, some changes made in the details in ways that advanced race equity. For example, instead of just getting waiting time credit from when you join the list, so in the US, unlike here, people have very different levels of access to healthcare. Some people were joining the transplant waiting list much earlier in the course of their disease, others not at all or not for a long time. So what they did was they said your priority date, instead of being from when you joined the list, is going to be from when you first began to need dialysis, which is basically a clinical marker that's the same regardless of your background, or more so than these other. Anyway, but the larger point is, so this was a collaborative democratic process that happened over a 10-year period. It required a lot of infrastructure to bring to the table people who weren't already experts. You can't just take sort of software code and suddenly throw it out into the world and say, aha, I've disclosed it. Now I'm being transparent. Well, no. Understanding this intricate technology requires expert perspective. And if you want to turn that into something where you can say in plain language, look, here's where the organs are going under the existing plan. Here's a new plan. Here's how it would be different. So for example, this auditing group did a thing where they said, look, here's the fraction of organs that go to each decade of life of patients. So, this plan to maximize benefit would mean that the number of transplants going to people in their 50s would fall by more than half. Well, okay, once I see that graph, I can really have a strong point of view about this. But if you just showed me, the binder full of detailed rules that graph is summarizing, right? I don't have the infrastructure to come up with that clear understanding. And so I think what we really end up learning is that intentionality about including people and investments, beyond the ones that you have to do in order to build the technology. If you really want to build democratically, that is a further investment.
Yeah, Elaine, David touched on the point of you showing this, you need to show a graph to someone and for them to be able to interpret it, right? You need to have a look at the data in a way that they can use it to make decisions and can understand the data. You spend a lot of time thinking about how to do that. I mean, it's an incredibly difficult process, but between the data and the algorithms, how close can we actually get to really understanding the decisions being made by these algorithms?
That's an interesting question. I'm going to mention the NIH, but I want to say I'm not representing the US government. So these are my views. So the project that I work on at the NIH called In My Head is focused on enhancing representation of communities that are underrepresented in the development of AI for biomedical research. These are also the communities that tend to be most impacted when AI algorithms do not work as they should. So David touched on several different points. So one is that community aspect. So this is one of the projects that NIH is trying to lead in terms of health equity around AI, where they want to have community input in the kinds of things that are being studied. So instead of just saying we're going to fund a list of topics and say these are the topics that we believe are important for health equity, we're going to have these communities tell us what is important to them. So what are the problems that they're facing and how can they use AI to solve those problems? Another topic that you touched on is infrastructure. So in addition to making sure that there is money for research, there is training, there's also the most important, or at least one of the most important aspects, infrastructure. So you can have ideas, you can have the training you need, but if you don't have infrastructure, you really can't create the AI models. So NIH is also investing in that aspect of it, so working with these communities to develop the infrastructures that they need to do that work. So coming back to the data question, so a lot of the work I do is thinking about how can we use data to improve health, or how can we use data and algorithms in a way that we do not exacerbate existing health inequalities or inequities. So inequalities I tend to think about, or just to define this term, so when I think about equality, I think of everyone in the room getting the same bicycle. So it doesn't matter whether you're tall or you're short, you all get the same size bicycle. That's equality. Equity, on the other hand, is the shorter people get smaller bicycles and the very tall people get bigger bicycles. So you're basically meeting people where they have the most need. So when I think about data and how data can be used in that aspect, I think about, is data representing the populations that we're trying to serve? And is that data unbiased in the sense that it represents different intersectional pluralities of individuals? So it's not just saying we're going to have data on women, but we're going to have data on women with different backgrounds, different challenges, or different ethnicities, different races, different socioeconomic backgrounds, so that when we build algorithms, we can have algorithms that take into account also all of those different factors and can be more equitable.
How do you know what those different sort of factors are, right? I mean, there seems to be an increasing number of like intersectionalities and like, how do you make sure that your algorithm is equitable to these increasing number of intersections?
I think a good place to start is asking very precise questions. So instead of assuming that an algorithm is going to serve everyone, can we develop algorithms that answer very specific questions and make sure that it's serving the communities that are most relevant in that context? So I can develop an algorithm to address breast cancer, but it wouldn't work for every single person. It might work only for particular people, depending on the data that I use in training an algorithm. And I think that transparency is also very important. So when we develop an algorithm and we implement it in particular settings, it's important to say it works in this setting, but might not work in another setting.
Okay. And David, you touched on that there with the sort of the kidney transplant list, right? And how it sort of was useful for a certain subpopulation.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one thing to say is that, when we think about some of the computational work on bias or fairness in algorithms, you have these toolkits now where, you can, a Python thing that you can download will do, 50 different diagnostic quantitative indicators of various kinds of bias. And it turns out you can't sort of zero out them all simultaneously. There are mathematical limits to that. So you do have to, I think, as Elaine was saying, you have to make what are in effect, if not often maybe named this way, but it's a prioritization question of what are the inequities. So maybe if it's bicycles, it's height, right? There are other dimensions that are going to matter for other kinds of things. And I think, being willing to say, this is the inequity that is at the forefront at the moment, and this is where we're going to begin, rather than sort of saying, there's the temptation to say that we should sort of solve every problem first, but really forward momentum requires often. So for example, in the case of the kidney algorithm, one of the big problems is that because of social determinants of health, so things like diabetes and blood pressure and stress that are correlated with minoritized status and with lower income, the need for kidney transplants in the African American community is 4 times as high as in the population at large. Meanwhile, blood types are also race correlated in such a way that donated organs, if you treat each one as a separate population, you end up with a shortage in blood type B. And so one of the changes that they made was they figured out a way with new technology to take some of the blood type A2 donated kidneys and transplant them successfully into recipients with blood type B, which is a group that has many more people of color proportionately than other blood types do. Well, that was something that was in part a matter of saying there's a real unfairness here. It was also necessary to sort of size things up and say there's a new technology. This was actually something pioneered in Japan of the breaking what's known as the ABO barrier, meaning in other words, transplanting successfully across blood types, right? Which was something that people for a long time had treated as being infeasible, right? Similarly, this immune matching, again, there are race-correlated antigens involved in the immuno matching, but it turns out over time that the immunosuppressive drugs that allow us to transplant from more different people to more different people, that open up more optionality for that, have gotten better. And as they've gotten better, it's become possible to use those factors less, which allows for a more open field of who can receive transplants. And so, just to validate or to enthusiastically second what Elaine said about needing to be specific about what questions can we ask and what better answers can we give.
I mean, just honing in on a part of that, you were saying, there were small changes that are, we're constantly improving our algorithms, we're constantly detecting biases and trying to update the algorithm. The kidney transplant process, the development of the algorithm was sort of a years-long process, almost a decade.
Yeah.
And, implemented after that. Mm-hmm. You need to take the buy-in. But if you're constantly updating and incrementally improving this algorithm, do you need to constantly engage with these communities? Can you update the algorithm, every 6 months or so?
I mean, it is a hard question of kind of, engaging. People talk about engaging communities and, I'm for that. Everyone is for that. Also, though, it takes a long time and imposes a burden not only on the process of whoever's doing the engaging, but on the communities to say, if we had a fourth chair, an empty chair sitting up here, and we said, impacted communities should come up and sit here, and if they don't, it's on them if they aren't represented. I mean, that's a burden. And so, it's a balancing act in practice. And I don't think it's the case that sort of more representation and more committees and more meetings is always the best thing that can be done next. I think sometimes it's the right move, right? But I think there is kind of a balancing or an art to sort of saying, how do we actually get to something that is an improvement? And even if it's an imperfect improvement, can we do that now and then come back to thinking about how to, make it better than what we've just launched even?
I think part of that is that we're constantly thinking about both from a social science perspective, what the appropriate metric for equality or equity is to for instance, optimize our models on. And that's changing, or we're introducing different objectives. How do you balance that when thinking about developing these new algorithms? How do you sort of choose what the metric is at the time when it's very unclear what's appropriate?
I think for me, it's, as a researcher, I tend to think about what is the specific question that I'm trying to answer and what would be the best way to measure equity or equality in that particular time. So I'm just thinking of a recent study we did where we were looking at distribution of resources in the built environment. So these are things like green space, sidewalks, presence of buildings that people cannot even live in, but the density differs for different communities in the US. And part of the reason why that exists is because in the 1930s, the US government created this policy that's called redlining. And they basically looked at different communities and decided what the risk of mortgage investment in that community was. And so that led to some communities getting a lot more investment. So they look better, they have better resources, while other communities had less investment, or lenders were discouraged from investing in those communities. And so studies today, looking back at those policies that were put in place in the 1930s, can still see that there is impact today. Those same communities that do not get a lot of investments, it's the same communities that are suffering today. So when in the study that we did, we were looking specifically at race. So what are the racial composition or segregation in different communities, different neighborhoods specifically, and how does that what is the association with access to those different built environment resources, and how does that also impact health outcomes in those communities?
Zooming out slightly, we had Fred speak about like when he was training, sort of setting up the African Leadership Academy, when they're sort of training software engineers, they're thinking about, they want to instill them with some ethics and values beforehand, thinking about that. At the moment, researchers in sort of AI spend a lot of time focused on the algorithmic component a lot, right? And trying to get them to engage with, for instance, the change management side of all of this, engaging with communities, but also training them on this sort of ethics and values component, looking at the intersectionalities. Like, this is a complex process with, just starting out in the field. How do we sort of start training both AI researchers, but also computational scientists to engage with each other?
We were just talking before the panel about the fact that when we're all combining, whether it's health and data science and some sort of ethics or humanities piece, we're all at the periphery of our competence in one way or another, right? Nobody has total depth in each of these things that we can all see need to be combined in order to have technologies benefit humanity, as trite as that may sound, or realize the best future that we can under a situation where these are our tools and circumstances. And so I have found personally that yes, you want some early exposure to different pieces of this puzzle. There is also a cultural piece that is about humility in trying to be willing to learn and be instructed and be changed really by other expertises and other, and expertise, I think, is a word that sounds like credentials, but if we're really honest about valuable knowledge and where it comes from, some of it is fancy and some of it is lived, including lived at the margins and often read out of these conversations. And so reading that back in is a huge piece, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree, especially on the idea of expertise. So what does it mean to be an expert? It's so easy I'm just thinking in terms of like a lot of global health work, there's a lot of conversation around decolonizing global health. And what happens is we have a lot of people from countries in Europe or the US who then go to African countries or India and then try to make decisions for those communities and believe that they are the expert, without acknowledging that the individuals in those communities are also experts. So it's a merging of two expertise. So you're saying, I have expertise in public health, but those people in those communities also have expertise in what works for them. They've lived for a long time in those communities, so they know what works and what doesn't work. And so you can merge those expertise to actually improve health if you're working in health.
I guess more specific then, how do you learn to speak the same language? You speak in two very different languages. For instance, you have to come up with some very algorithm. You have to train a model in some way, define it. On the other hand, you need to engage with these communities, and they need to be able to understand what this is doing, how to better how it's going to serve them. How do you combine that?
I think it takes time, like everything takes time. But there's also a component of trust. So it's not just, you have expertise, communities have expertise, and then let's work together and everything is going to be good. A lot of communities that have been oppressed have that history to look to, and so they might be hesitant sometimes when people outside of those communities come to work with them, whether they're doing AI algorithms or they're doing something else. So building that trust can take time. It can take years. And then in that process of building trust, you can also learn their language. And so it's not so much you teaching them your language. Sometimes you need to learn how they speak so you can communicate to them in a way that they understand.
And I'm going to nerd out a little bit here because that language analogy is one that, so Peter Gallison, who's a historian of science, talks about this idea of contact languages between different communities, or like a pigeon of, in other words, even if you each come with different ways of using words, and by talking with each other over time, you evolve some shared or overlapping language. And literally sometimes it does mean like a word like equity, for example, or in the context of data science, you're talking about something like bias. That is like a word that has both a statistical, technical meaning and a rich, situated social meaning. And maybe you end up talking about things where those meanings are both happening at the same time. We're talking about, getting rid of bias, and partly we're talking about, addressing a social problem, and partly also we're talking about improving some quantitative trait that a model has, and we're kind of doing both at the same time, and it's messy. I mean, but doesn't that make it exciting and challenging, right?
Definitely makes it challenging.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to open up the question to the floor because we've got another 20 minutes left. Oh.
Hi, so it's really, really interesting to hear what you have to say. I have a million questions, but I'll ask one. So it's down to, so there's this idea of almost like democratizing AI and things like that. You have things like open data sets, you have transfer learning, you have all these different tools that enable maybe people who don't have as much resources or you have to have less resources to be able to, answer a specific question. So my question to you would be, what role do you think that democratization has to play in terms of mitigating bias? Do you think that it can enhance bias? And like, what is your take?
My first thought is that it can reduce bias in the sense that if you have people with diverse experiences, people from disadvantaged backgrounds having access to those resources and they're able to produce those models, then they also can bring in those experiences into those spaces and can address some of the maybe the topics or the biases that we are not obvious to other people from different backgrounds. But I also wonder if in the long run, it's not just sufficient to say, we're going to give a little bit to individuals who are from lower income backgrounds, for example, so they can build some AI models. How do we build sustainable systems such that they too can contribute to some of the other types of models that are being developed by people who have more resources?
Yeah, I strongly agree that in practice, we live in a world where so many of the systems we're all living under one system. And so this sense of like empowering people to go build their own systems, I think in some instances doesn't take us all the way to where we would want to go. Like if there's one allocation regime for kidneys in the United States, then like one can't build one's own regime. The question is, how do we create something that is accountable? How does the one thing that we're living under end up being accountable and responsive, particularly to the perspectives that would otherwise be missed? And so I do think, it's a balancing act because, even something like come to the committee meeting where the algorithm about transplant is being debated, in a way, that can be kind of parallel to like, here, go to a coding camp, learn the skills or build your own thing. Both of these are, are resource-intensive undertakings. And so, I think giving resources to communities to sort of also to engage. So like things like simple things like, are people paid for their time? Like, is there childcare if we're talking about something where perspectives include like parents of young kids? I mean, there are all these kinds of things that are about kind of creating circumstances where people really can engage. And separately from that, to your point about sort of democratizing AI, potentially being, I wonder if you wonder, could it sometimes be a bit of a distraction from like, really, what's the equity impact of the thing that ends up getting built? And I think for many of these, like, that's what really ultimately is the yardstick. And so, sometimes, democracy might help us get there, but it's not like just because there was a committee, we're going to say, well, whatever it came up with must be great because it's a democracy. Instead, for many of these cases, it's like we've got some external idea, external, I mean, to the process. We've got some other idea about what it is that makes something fair or good, and we're trying to get closer to that, whether through a committee or whatever technique.
I think ideally for for me, it would be taking those resources that are made available and to answer a question that is important to me or to my community. So if I can take all of those tools and solve a problem that's important to me, then I think that's more equitable.
I mean, so I think one of the things that are interesting is like we're moving towards increasingly larger and larger models where fewer and fewer can sort of train these. Like you can't have that sort of system where you can apply it to X community. You need these large models to be equitable to everybody. In that case, how do you ensure that these few companies have equitable systems in place?
I think the companies should want to, they have to be like, they have to want to have equitable systems, right? Like we can demand things from companies, but if they're not willing to engage in that process of developing more equitable systems, then they will not develop those systems. So maybe the other option is how can we develop more equitable systems outside of those companies? Are there things that we as a community of individuals who are interested in equity in this space can do to create those kinds of systems?
Yeah, I think, and I'll on a technical level, I think one of the things is, you're looking at some techniques. Like I was reading a paper yesterday about languages where the training corpora are much smaller than for other languages, and how do we get recognition and synthesis of those languages to be better? And one of the answers is that at a more fundamental machine learning level, we need to be better at learning patterns from fewer examples. So you talk about this idea of like few shot learning, right? That's like, okay, and similarly, if we're personalizing something for an individual or for a smaller community, it's like, what can we do with fewer examples? And one, this is something that, perhaps at Apple, it's very much in the thought process just because we like to do so much on device, like for privacy and other reasons. And so, the question of like, where can we take a problem and federate it into smaller pieces that are, easier to do with less compute and less. So anyway, I do think there is some connectivity between what are we doing equitably for marginalized groups or underrepresented parts of the kind of population of data, and kind of what are our techniques for sort of, learning as much signal from what data that we have that we can.
Where's Munir? Oh, cool. Yeah.
But I have the mic. Hi. So, I was thinking purely from so I work in the intersection of tech and penal governance. So I'm purely coming from democratic theory point of view. And I was thinking probably the third word here I feel should be negotiation. Because I feel like when if we are building community projects, we cannot have a monolithic idea for community. And within that community, you will not have a monolithic idea of security and risks. Then how do we negotiate competing ideas of, security and risk within community projects? So is there a need for us to, rethink what do we mean by participation? Is there a need for us to sort of also think about, whether escalation or sort of AIzing things the only way, or maybe we need to sort of come up with a more negotiated model where there is AIing and there is also de-AIing. So like, I'm sort of curious to know how, when you do community projects, you deal with competing and conflicting notions of security.
I'll say that I think the word community, if we're being theoretical about it and we say something like, our communities or my community, we sort of mean all the right people. Like all the people who should be in are in. And when you're kind of thinking about it at a theoretical level, you have the luxury of being able to sort of theorize that you've got the exact right room with the exact right people. In any real room, as you say, anything where it's a community, we could think about like the community of all life in some huge expansive sense, but anything that, does its deliberating in finite time is, a subset of all the possible. And that means there's a boundary somewhere, and there are people and concerns outside of that boundary. And I don't think, so if we think about inclusion as being a world in which there doesn't end up being any boundary, I don't think that's really descriptive of what the options are. And it sounds like maybe we're all agreeing that, and so then trying to be honest and be clear about those boundaries and limits. So for example, in the transplant case, there was this huge, years-long debate about how do we get from the list of people who need an organ to the organs and who gets an organ. But what's not in that conversation is like, how do people get on the list in the first place? Who's not on the list, right? It's missing.
Yeah, my question is pretty general, and that is, what's the worst that can happen? Like, what are the stakes, and what are the riskiest assumptions that we're making?
So what's that can happen
In terms of bias in artificial intelligence, in your context, or however you want to interpret it?
I think in my context, the worst that can happen is that we continue to create AI systems that are inequitable and continue to exacerbate what we already know in terms of inequity in the world.
I mean, I think two things. One, so if we're talking about transplants, particularly not for kidneys, but for like hearts or lungs, if you don't get one, you die. So it's life and death in that sense. But the other thing to say is there's this culture of deferring to the computer, right? So there's this sense in which decisions that come out of computed software things, it's like a moral quantification can be a moral anesthetic where it just seems natural and normal. And we lose our sense of what we might otherwise, if sort of seen in a more human dimension, we would be maybe outraged or impelled to press for change if we think things are wrong. But, wrongness that gets turned into the computer's correct answer, I think, can be naturalized is one of the risks.
Hi, I know that both of the speakers here are somewhat involved with academia, and I'm asking kind of from an academia standpoint. So 2 questions. A, as a researcher in, say, neurobiology, for example, how can you do in your research to kind of prevent bias, like from like a day-to-day, like concrete level, like what are some important things, important checklists for yourself, and also B, on like a systematic level, like we see there are scholars doing really important work on preventing bias, on focusing on minority groups, but their work in this entire academia, like intellectual context, may not be properly credited or recognized. For example, they might not be viewed as the most important academic question to study. Why not look at population cells in spatial navigation? So like, how do you think the system could change? So for example, a lot of the real environmental change happens when this idea of sustainable investing, when people with big funds came into the industry world, and that push for the industry to change in that progressive direction. How can we change the academia framework in thinking about what are the important questions to consider when usually there are not massive amount of funding or donors involved?
That's a great question. I think one thing, especially in the US context, is encouraging community-based research or community-engaged research. That's not something that is always funded. So I think that's one way that it could create a massive change, especially when we think about technology. How do we bring communities into that space and make sure that we center their voices and their experiences? I think your first part was like, what do we do on a day-to-day basis? So one thing that I do personally is when I'm writing papers, I will go through the references and make sure that I'm not just citing the people that at the top of Google Scholar, and go out and look for scholars who are of a different race, different ethnicity, people who have been doing this work for a long time but are usually not recognized.
Yeah, that's a really good, I mean, not to sit in judgment or anything, but that's absolutely a practice. That's like one of these pieces where, because who gets cited, there are these kind of winner-take-all dynamics to being at the top of the list for a given proposition that needs authority. And then, I mean, I just also would say within the technical world, there's a realignment of subfields. Let's say within computer science happens to be one where I'm more involved. So, data science and the theoretical and mathematical side of it has always been very important. I have noticed recently that I think that the sort of human factors and human computer interface side of the of the field, more people seem to be more focused on more of that than was the case 5 or 10 years ago. And I think what that basically means, it's like taking the people part in addition to the data part and lifting it up in terms of prestige and importance and recognition, partly due to a long overdue recognition that all of that stuff mediates the extent to which the math or the model can actually have a positive impact in the world. We have to think about, if we're making recommendations or judgments, like how is it socially situated? What's the part of the social world that's outside of the model, but matters to it? So, there's one place that I hope to sort of see gain in stature over time.
Similar to the previous question, why isn't bias prevention built into the algorithm? So with your example of the kidney donor selection, when you looked at what the algorithm produced, you could obviously see that there was something unfair in that. Why could you not build that into the algorithm so that it checked itself whether or not there was bias? Is it a lack of data sets or something else?
I mean, I think so. In that case, so with something like the improving immunosuppression or the advent of the ability to do transplants across blood types, part of it is like we need to be updating and revisiting. So for some of these things where it's unfair, it's like that was the best we could do at the time because like we didn't know how to do transplants across these barriers biologically, and now we can. And so I think there's kind of out of date assumptions. But the other piece is, no one's going to be completely happy with a transplant system. So, younger people may always be in a position to say, we would benefit more. Why are we not at the front of the line? And so I think there's no sort of, another of the pieces here is that there's sort of no perfect answer. And part of what happened, at least in what I was studying, was that people got to a point where there was like a mutually tolerable compromise. And realistically speaking, future improvements are going to take us to another also imperfect compromise point.
I think we have time for one last question. Oh, there we go. Cool.
So for bias prevention mitigation, I saw that some of the speakers today have mentioned that if the data sets are flawed, we can have more representative data sets. Or if there's algorithmic biases, we should make sure that they're transparent about the algorithms that they're using, so that, for example, other researchers from other organizations can identify flaws. But equally, if the solutions we're proposing are kind of transparency, which is ends sometimes with a company's mission to produce proprietary software, and equally, if kind of a solution to producing less flawed data sets is to then kind of introduce more data collection, how do we balance the need for privacy and proprietary software with bias prevention mitigation?
It's just possible technologically, but yeah, there's privacy because you're doing data analysis now.
For some things, I mean, I think the other thing is, the question of what should be done, in a private and closed source context is a live one politically. And for some of these things, people think, and I mean, I certainly would say there are certain things that if we're going to do it by an algorithm, we ought to expect a level of transparency and of accountability, that might make it not the most attractive thing for a private company to do, as in the case of, say, the transplant thing, but also other things, courtrooms or social services or whatever. Accountability, I think, for stuff like that comes first. And then the question is, how can we build in a way that is democratically accountable?
I think normalizing auditing is another thing that we can do. Like, auditing shouldn't be a bad word, which is like, you've done something bad, so now we get to audit your algorithms. It should be something that we do regularly to make sure that the algorithms are working as they should.
Yeah, sort of like in every single company has to get audited. So why don't the algorithms do?
Yeah.
Cool. I think on that point, we're running out of time. Feel free to contact Elaine and David afterwards.